DreAllDay.com.
Dre Baldwin, DreAllDay.com. Let's talk accountability. This is a topic that anybody who ever talks about discipline or anyone who's ever in a leadership position, and this includes not only leadership of other people, but also personal leadership of yourself when it comes to accountability. And I talk about accountability in almost all of my books. My book, Work on Your Game, I talked about it. In my newest book, The Third Day, I talk about closing those accountability gaps. The accountability gap is that gap between how much you hold yourself accountable for your actions and the things you're supposed to do, your commitments, versus how much you need other people to hold you accountable. How big is that gap between what other people got to point out to you and how much you're actually pointing it out to yourself? But here's the thing about accountability that I found is become more and more needed these days because it's in less and less supply. Any of you knows anything about economics, you know that the supply and demand curve, the lower the supply is for something, the higher the demand gets. Like, for example, I got these, you can't even see them. I can't lift my leg while I'm driving, but I got these Jordans on that are in low supply. They make them hard to get. Any of you like sneakers, basketball sneakers, you try to find some Jordans, they're hard to get. And because they're so hard to get, the price goes up, the demand goes up because there are fewer of them out there. And so the lower the supply is of something, the higher the demand becomes. And right now the demand for accountability is super high simply because there's so little of it in our society. And at the same time, there's so little of it. Now we have more and more people advocating to completely eliminate any and all accountability in so many different areas, because it's as if everybody who, for whatever reason, could be held accountable, we are coming up with manufacturing reasons that, oh, we don't need to hold this person accountable because, well, look at these people over here. Or we don't need to hold them accountable because, well, something happened to them 10 years ago. We don't need to hold anyone in this group accountable because people who look like them or sound like them or come from the place that they're from, well, look at all the bad things that happened to them 20 years ago or 200 years ago. So there's less and less accountability, and the demand for accountability is getting lower and lower, and people are actually demanding to remove accountability completely. And here's the point that I want you to understand. When I was growing up, and this is the reason why I talk about accountability the way that I do. When I was growing up, and I don't know if any of you grew up like this, my parents, for example, when I go to school, they would say something like, let's say I went and got in trouble in school. I was doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing. Let's say everybody was doing stuff they weren't supposed to be doing, and we all got in trouble. But when I got home, it's not like all my classmates were at home with me. It was just me and my parents. So my mom would say something like, and I don't know if any of y'all had this situation, my mom would say something along the lines of, well, look, I don't give a damn what all the other kids did, or even if it was 2 of y'all or 20 of y'all or 200 of y'all, all y'all got in trouble for doing the wrong thing. Doesn't matter because you did the wrong thing. You know right from wrong. You know the rules of what we taught you here in this house. So if you violate those outside of this house, I don't care if 1,000 other people violate it or you were the only one who violated by yourself, you're going to have to deal with me. Let's say my mom would say something like that because you didn't do what you were supposed to do. Doesn't matter if anybody else did it as well. That's what the accountability was about. And I always, still to this day, look at things from that perspective. Doesn't matter if other people did something that was necessarily wrong. If I do something wrong, then that means I'm wrong. And I got to be held accountable for that. And I got to own that. And I got to stand on the actions. I got to stand on my own actions. I can't look at it and say, well, yeah, I did something that I wasn't supposed to do. But look, these 2 other people or these 30 other people, they did something wrong as well, so that it should cancel out what I did. That didn't fly in the environment that I came up in. I don't know how it works in the environment that any of y'all are from or any of the environments that you all are in these days, but it didn't work in the environment that I come from. And personally, and I talked about this on my podcast, I got an episode where I talk about personal culture. What is your culture as an individual person? What are your standards as an individual person? I still hold myself to those same standards. Any of you knows anything about my story, when I first started playing sports, and my background is playing ball professionally overseas for almost a decade. But when I first started playing, I wasn't good. I didn't have anybody teaching me or nothing like that. And my parents were not athletes. So when I started playing ball, I just took the disciplines and the standards and that personal accountability stuff that I just told you about, that I got at home for doing stuff like, go to school, do your chores, simple parenting kid stuff. And I applied that in the sports world, and it worked. So then I took those same principles and I applied it in the business world, and now that's what I do. So this stuff, I know that it works, and it made me into the type of person that I am, first in the sports world, now in the business world. So these days, when I see people just wanting to completely eliminate accountability or completely discount accountability so that they can give themselves a free pass for their actions or for their lack of actions, that just doesn't sit well with me. That doesn't fly well. It doesn't fly with me when I see people trying to do that. The bottom line is, whatever things you did or you didn't do, you got to own them. If you didn't do your job, then you got to own the fact, you didn't do your job, and you got to own the consequences of that. You got to own the ramifications of whatever things that you either did or that you didn't do. And the less accountability that we have in any type of society, the more chaos we get. That's what happens when you remove accountability, is that you get chaos. This is one of the laws of thermodynamics. It's called entropy. The law of entropy states that any organism or any situation, any organization, if it's left to its own devices over a period of time, and there are no checks and balances, there's no system of checks and balances to keep everything organized, eventually it goes into a state of disorganization. And if you think about that, even if you don't know anything about the laws of thermodynamics, you think about it, it makes perfect sense, right? Think about if when you were in school as a kid, let's say up through like middle school, elementary school and middle school, if there was no teacher in the classroom, what would happen in that classroom over the course of the day? Eventually, it would become chaos. The kids would be, y'all as kids, us, would be playing around, throwing stuff around, acting up, doing all kinds of stuff that we would never do if the regular teacher was there in the room watching us, because we know there are certain standards we got to live up to when there's a teacher in the room, and certain standards that we live up to when there's no supervision. And it's the same thing with all of us. Any of you who works at a job, when the boss is there at work, there's certain standards you got to uphold and live up to, and if you don't, there's going to be a problem. You might end up losing your job. But if the boss is not there, the boss goes away for an hour or something like that, what happens? All the workers, sometimes in some workplaces, depends on the level of work that you're working at, but in the kind of jobs that I worked at, menial jobs when I was a teenager, we would just start playing around. When the managers didn't enforce the rules, or they weren't around to enforce the rules, we would just start playing around, doing dumb stuff, having food fights, laughing, joking, doing stuff we wouldn't do when the boss was in the room. That is the humanization of this law of entropy. That's what entropy looks like when there are no checks and balances in place. And for us as individual people, our checks and balances is accountability. All right, how accountable are you holding yourself for the actions that you take, and how accountable do you allow yourself to be held for the actions that you have taken? And the more accountability you have, that's usually the more disciplined the person is. And usually, if we even go even further, usually the more successful that individual is. Now, I don't want you to take my word for that. I want you to think about in your own life. Think about yourself. When you've had a lot of accountability in place in your life, usually you probably have done some really good work. Why? Because what is accountability? If we really think about it, accountability is simply standards. It's expectations. And when you have standards and expectations placed upon you by somebody who you respect, usually what do? You live up to those standards and expectations. Magic formula. When there's standards and expectations by somebody you respect, you usually find a way to live up to them. But when there are no standards or no expectations, or you just decide that you don't want to live up to the standards or expectations, how do you perform? Usually pretty poorly. You get into that state of entropy. This is what happens with all of us as human beings. I call it a magic formula, but I'm really being tongue-in-cheek. This is a simple formula. There's no magic to it whatsoever. Any of us can do this, but we have to be, first of all, willing to accept accountability, and secondly, first of all, able to apply it to ourselves, and third, we got to go out and actually look for where can we apply more accountability in our own lives so that we can raise our performance level to a higher level. It is not, again, magic for us to perform at a higher level. It's just a matter of, are we holding ourselves accountable and giving ourselves standards that we absolutely have to live up to? Not things we do, optionally, but things that we do all the time. We do it as a standard. We do it as a normal way of operation. So what I want you to ask yourself for here what I want you to ask yourself about here, this is your call to action from this video, is where are your standards? What is your accountability? What are you expecting of yourself? And are you actually holding yourself to those standards and accountabilities? Because when you do, your level of performance will be reflected in it. And the longer you can keep those standards up and keep living up to them, the longer your performance, high level performance, will stay high level performance. But if it's random, it's up and down, it's sometimes and not this time, it's yeah today but not tomorrow, well, we all know results from that. You've been alive long enough, you know exactly what happens. I don't even need to go into that. So with all that said, if you want to get my daily motivation text free of charge straight to your phone every single day, all you got to do is text me at my text number, which is 305-384-6894. I'll send it to your phone free of charge every day. And when you're ready to go to the next level with me, Work on Your Game University, that's where you can get into working with me directly. That's the only place to work with me directly, is inside of my university, where I have my mastermind programs, coaching programs. You can find out about those by going to the link that is below in the description, wherever you're watching this. That is workonyourgameuniversity.com. Work on your game. Dre all day.